Good afternoon, everybody. Hello. Hi. Thank you for staying. I'm not going to name him, but last year a senior politician from London said to me that he always stays for this event and it's the start of Christmas for him. And you may laugh because I was genuinely moved. He knows who he is, and I was really touched when he said that to us. So Tony and I are your Christmas gig, the start of Christmas. And the bad news is there's no cartoons this year. Now, I have not fallen out with Martin Rosen. No. Martin and I are still very good friends. We still commission his cartoons. I'm going to do a few before the elections. But there are, however, some new graphs, some new maps, and they'll be made available, hopefully, on Monday for you all, if you're interested in them. And I think all of you also get a copy of this. And this is the London Council Guide, which we've sponsored for 9 years now. And I think it's the number of years we've spoken together at this event, Tony. And we're delighted to go on supporting your work. And listening to Peter this morning, his very appropriate comments about how tough it is in local government at the moment, that my company's support is reflected in coming today and in supporting this. And we want to do all we can to help you to run London as well as possible at local level. So thank you very much for inviting us again. Of course, next year, as we know, is local elections. And what's interesting this time around, and Tony and I were discussing this yesterday, is in 2005 we had a general election, the year before the local elections. And thanks to Theresa May, we've had a snap general election the year before. In fact, the gap between the general election and the local elections is that much tighter, which is quite interesting. But of course, probably a third of you in this room today are almost certainly going to get re-elected. Probably a third of you will probably get re-elected, and probably a third of you are quite worried about whether you will get elected. And so it's very interesting, therefore, for us to be talking to you today about what might happen. Now, the structure is we're going to remind ourselves of the political landscape, and I'll pass over to Tony shortly to do that. We'll touch on a few issues, and then I'm going to look at 3 boroughs in London, 3A, B, and C there, and pose those questions. And then we'll touch on momentum, because we can't really go through an election event without talking about that, and a little bit, and then we'll sum up at the end. And so let's just start with London's political landscape. And first off, I'm going to do my famous quiz. So, some of you know this before, but anyone like to tell me what year that was? Now, I have to apologise, Bexley was no overall control, not Liberal Democrat. It was a Liberal Democrat Labour coalition back then. But 94, very good, well done. Who was that? Very good indeed, sir, very good, well done. So, and of course, picking up, and we'll touch on this later, the big 3 Tory boroughs in the middle were still Conservative control, but they only ran 4 back in this period, 17 for Labour. Of course, this was 2/3 of the way through halfway through John Major's term of office in the run-up to 97. So a low ebb for the Tories. Conversely, who would like to tell me what year that one is? 2006, absolutely. No, not 2006, sorry, 1980, anyone? 1982. Conservatives running 16 outright and 4 minority administrations for the Conservatives there, with Labour running 12. So you had, I think, these 4, 2 different types. Conservative with mayoral vote and Conservative minority. I was still at university then, so I don't remember the politics so well of London back then, but shows you how much it can change. Of course, the Liberal Democrats were not then a force. And the final one, a bit nearer to home and more recent, 2006, absolutely, 2006, and Peter will know that well because of how Southwark was being run back then, of course, and Camden and Brent and Hounslow, a very interesting thing. Of course, 8 out of 32 were no overall control. So I'm now going to hand over to Tony, who's going to run through a few more slides.
Yeah, I'm going to look at the state, or where we've got to really with national politics, which I'm always aware of events of this kind. We can't read across from national polling and general elections straight into local elections. It's the wrong thing to do. But that's not to say that there aren't things in national politics which don't affect local politics. And what this is a British voting intention chart running from 2006 all the way across to 2017. And you can see there, period, when the Conservatives were doing better during the run up to 2010, didn't quite win the election as it turned out then, and then went down and then came back, winning a surprise election in 2015, though not quite in 2017. And of course, what you can see at the end there is a big step up for Labour, and by the time we get to 2017, effectively, not exactly the return of two-party politics. And sorry to everybody else who isn't a Labour or Conservative politician in the room, but the truth is you can see big drops in Green, UKIP and Liberal Democrat votes towards the end. Now, that's not to say they couldn't come back, but a big step back towards two-party politics in the general election this year, reinforcing the fact that in London, London has always remained broadly, not in every borough, but a Conservative Labour city with some Liberal Democrat and other politics in some boroughs. If we look at the general election, now this is looking at general election vote shares all the way back to 1955, so Anthony Eden's election victory. We won't go through all of them, saying who was the winner or loser, but back. And what you see is that for a long time, up to the 1990s, the Labour and Conservative parties there, you know, up and down a bit, some down and up, but then towards the end here, a substantial step up, particularly at the 2017 general election. The unexpected May, June 2017 election, seemed like that, months long, up there to 55%, which is the largest vote share for any party in the general election ever in London. So that is a remarkable result this time. And you can see there the fall away in the Liberal Democrat vote, just picking up fractionally. And in fact, in fairness to the Conservatives in the general election this year, not doing too badly. And of course, the fall away was, of course, amongst others, including on this occasion UKIP. This chart simply takes the data in that chart and compares it with the Great Britain vote share. London used to be a place, so effectively, if the Conservatives get 43% in London, 43% nationally, it appears as 0 on that line, ditto Labour, any other party. And you find really up to the 1990s, in fact, London, despite being odd, was in many ways more like Britain as a whole in vote shares than any other region, more than the northeast, more than the southeast, more like Britain than any other region. But from 1997 onwards, a pickup in terms of Labour doing slightly better in London than elsewhere. Conservatives fractionally less well, Liberal Democrats a bit less well, but not anything massive. And then in the last couple of elections, but particularly 2017, Labour continuing their overperformance relative to the Great Britain average, but look at the drop there in the Conservative vote. I don't want to be depressing for Conservative councillors in the room, but it is an issue. And you know, if you anybody who was at the London conference the other day and heard Stephen Hammond, who's the vice chairman for London, speaking, you know, I think the Conservative Party corporately has come to realise that it's got to do something about its London identity to stop that continuing. And of course, if you look at this is just for the borough elections, what that one was for general election. So here, actually, notice these lines are closer all the way down there. So what we're seeing here is that whatever goes on in general elections doesn't necessarily translate through to local elections at the same scale. So there is everything to fight for in these local elections. And although you can see, so the Conservatives and Labour more or less up and down together there, Liberal Democrat vote falling away in 2014, question will it pick up, the others vote, a lot of it UKIP, doing very well in 2014, question will it fall away? Well, the polls sort of suggest that there will be some reversal there. And what this does now, this is interesting, Queen Mary University, part of the University of London, have started to commission London polls. We've had London polls before, of course, to do with mayoral election, but they're now asking questions about local voting intention. And this is one, this was a poll done in October 2017, showing a general election voting intention of 43-23, Labour Conservative in London, Liberal Democrats on 7 there, and you can see all the others. Then in the locals, a slightly fractionally smaller, not with a margin of error stuff really, in the local elections. Now, all I'd say is I'd be a bit careful of this one, not because I think the poll's wrong, but in the sense that I would expect squeezing of this when we get to the actual local elections. That's what all the past suggests. It'll be a narrower difference between the major parties. And of course, you can see the Liberal Democrats doing a little bit better in the local voting intention than in the general election. The other thing to know about this is that I'm told that they're going to do polls on the borough elections. They're going to do 3 polls in the run-up to the elections this May. or this coming May. So we will get local election polling in London for the first time for the borough elections. That is a really interesting step in terms of our knowing what's going on out there. So well done, Queen Mary. Robert.
I think many of you will have seen this one before. This is my heat map of showing the number of councillors in each borough from the 2014 election, updated with the few changes there have been since then. And one of the things it reinforces for me is obviously the sheer scale of the majorities, primarily now for Labour, but historically even still for some Conservative boroughs, and almost that sort of polarisation. What we've now done, and this is a new slide you might be interested to see, is we've applied that to the MP seats from this summer. So the darker the red, the higher the majority, the darker the blue, the higher majority. Again, you see the parallel heat map being reflected in the general election. And on the day of the after election, I tweeted that over 20 MP seats of over 10,000 majority and another 12 or so of over 20,000 majority for Labour, and that 28 of them actually had over 20,000. So massive sheer number of votes in there, and you can see the strength of that. And you can also therefore see where the marginal seats are, the lower coloured seats. Now, when you come to talk about Barnet, for example, for the local elections with a majority of only one, however, the Conservatives did hold those seats, albeit with reduced majorities, in the northwest corner of London, which is interesting in comparison to Battersea, which obviously went as a very high-profile seat, or as we know, Kensington. So, and that map's available if anyone would like it. So final slide here, just to remind ourselves of the last three elections and how the map is looking at the moment, and the base starting from today: 20 Labour, 9 Conservative, 1 Lib Democrat, 2 no overall control. I always debate whether Tower Hamlets is no overall control. I don't know if Will Chuckley's here, the Chief Exec, whether he can elaborate for me, but Labour Mayor and an interesting coalition of parties there. So some issues at play, just 3 just to touch on, and you know these better than Tony and I. The first, obviously, is how much London is continuing to change rapidly over these 4 years. A couple of statistics here that I think are particularly interesting, that how young London is, and that was interesting with Ben Page's work this morning that we saw about voting intention for younger people, the disparity between young and old. The diversity, of course, continuing to change, diversity of London rapidly and growing. But of course, the other thing, and this is something I know that a number of leaders of councils and politicians and their advisors, is that EU nationals can, of course, vote in the local elections. And with 1.2 million, 12% nearly of the population. Very interesting. So we have to be aware of demographics continue to change. And turnout. So quick poll question now to come. So here is turnout since 1968. You can see how it dropped when, I think we blame Tony Blair actually. So what's the point in voting after he won the general election in 97?
This of course was the year of the community
poll
charge
tax,
poll
yes.
tax.
Blame Thatcher for that one.
That year.
So I'm going to go for a turnout of over 40%. Tony, what are you going to do?
I think it'll be slightly lower than that figure last time.
So in memory of Bruce Forsyth, lower or higher? Higher, put your hands up. Higher, put your hands up. Who thinks it can be over 40? Who thinks it can be under 40? Oh, sod it.
Good people. You are my people. Thank you for this. This is, of course, the trouble with this is we'll find out. It's something that
you can remember this one. So next year, I'll be so smug if I'm right. I'll tell you, I will be so smug.
And you'll remind us.
And I will remind you, Tony. Now, Tony's just going to touch on the third one, which of course is tax.
Yes. I mean, what this is going to do, what this does is just show how the position has changed in terms of the approach to council tax. And this is partly to do with borough's own thinking, but partly also to do with national government thinking, which has done an all-engines reverse job, really, on council tax after holding it down for years and now seeing it as the solution, or at least the temporary partial solution, to the problems of funding adult care. So back in 2013-14, looking at the boroughs, we see 24 boroughs freezing council tax, with 2 reducing council tax and 6 raising it.
Can anybody name me the 6 who raised it in the year before the election? They were raised the tax: Lewisham, Wandsworth, Bromley, Croydon, Harrow, Kingston. I think that's right. So interesting how 4 years ago only 6 did. So and
if we move on to 2017-18,
current year,
which is the year we're in, I mean the council tax is set at the beginning of this financial year, a very different position, with still 3 freezing the council tax, but 29 boroughs increasing it. Of course, this is a big change, partly inspired and encouraged, I guess, by national government's change in relation to council tax.
But the interesting thing, again, about Ben's presentation this morning about the voters' attitude towards more tax against austerity to spend on things you really want. And we'll be watching, very interesting to see what each of you boroughs decide to do for next May, for next council tax year, and how much support you get if you say, look, we are going to put it up by so much because we want to spend it on the following things that we believe our voters care about. And Julian and I talked about this only last week in my borough Ealing as to the decisions that each borough has got to make as they come up to this. So now let's get on to some boroughs. So I'm going to show you a subjective slide and an objective slide before we get into analysis. The subjective slide is these broad assumptions. Now, I'm not going to read them out. I'm not going to overly defend them or justify them. I'm going to say that Tony and I sitting there talking with my team, that is our sort of broad headline assumption subjectively of where things are in London currently now for the main parties in a single line. And the bottom one, independents, are interesting because of what might happen in one or two boroughs come next May. Then we said, well, let's try and get a bit more objective.
What you mean by danger, of course, is two major parties. I mean, they're not a danger to the city. We're in the city. We're in the city after all here, Robert.
Sorry, thank you.
Where independents rule happily.
Then we said,
well, apart from the ones who aren't, obviously.
Exactly.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I know there are.
Then we said, could we create a vulnerability test for some key boroughs statistically? Could we look more objectively at those? And I sat with my research team. We talked about the gap. You all know this as councillors between the person who comes first and the person who comes sixth, and the person who comes third. The person comes fourth in a 3-ward seat. You know the game, you see the numbers, you see the difference. So we said, let's hone in on key boroughs with key wards where we think the vulnerability test is interesting from 2014. And let's look at the analysis and then apply the swing needed in order to shift those key seats, with everything else being equal, of course. And as I was talking to Ravi, and, it depends on what happens in each ward, in each borough, who the candidates are, what the scandals are, what the good things are, what the bad things. And look at the swing. And then also use the general election as a benchmark, with the caveat there that was a general election, but it was only 3 months ago. So we then said, let's look at 3 boroughs. And the first one we're going to look at, and I think he's left, Ravi. Has he left? I think he's left. Is dear old Ravi's borough in Wandsworth. Right, so the first thing we did was, we said, let's plot the the local election vote share in Wandsworth over the last 3. So you can see that 06, 010, 014. The first thing you see is Labour, as we know, gradually increasing its vote share in Wandsworth.
And it's worth adding, of course, we've got, towards the end of the Labour government, general election day, after the coalition's been in power for a bit. So you have to aim off for that slightly, because that's a sort of...
And then we overlaid the general elections, the 3 general election vote shares, in dotted lines. And you can see for the first time in an election in recent times, be it in the general election, Labour overtaking the Conservatives in the constituency. Of course, we saw Battersea go Labour, so you can see why. So you say, OK, this makes this a more vulnerable council than perhaps it might have been a few years ago. And then we said, right, let's look at the most narrow wards in this borough. So these are the most narrow wards in the borough. The dark red line was the swing to Labour from the Conservatives in the general election in that ward. So 10% swing, that was the swing. The dotted line that comes down here is the level of swing needed to take the number of seats to get a majority of 1, assuming Labour hold the rest of their seats in Wandsworth. Okay? You see where the dotted line is. Now, on top of that, there was a by-election only last week in one of the safest wards in Wandsworth, held by the Conservative. Well done. But the swing to Labour in that ward was 4.8%. So if that was applied, the dotted line moves further out, and you could see possibly on that very simple exercise. Now, that is scientific up to a point, but is indicative of the level of work Labour needs to turn Wandsworth in May. And of course, let's not forget, politically, of course, it's Sadiq Khan's old stamping ground, so you can imagine he will be quite interested in canvassing and campaigning here. So you can see the vulnerability test here is quite high.
The one thing I would sort of add, and Robert's hinted at this is not a prediction, it's an analysis, is that...
The P word has not crossed my lips yet today.
That I personally would be very surprised if the scale of the swing in the general election were repeated in local elections. I'd be very surprised if that happened, personally. Having said that, most of my political predictions are wrong. So, but it would be unlikely. I think lots of things were caught up in this unexpected shift, and we have to be cautious at assuming necessarily it will be replicated. Sorry, Robert.
So let's look at a second one, a Liberal Democrat fight back. And Kevin Davis was here earlier, and I showed him the slide on this because I don't think he could stay. But I said, let's look at Kingston. So here again is the local elections. And you can see there the Conservatives with their vote share. It's interesting actually how Labour have quietly been doing quite well in Kingston in terms of vote share over the last 2 elections. Eating in possibly to the Liberal Democrat share maybe, and it's all tightened up there. Overlay the general elections and the MP seats, and obviously Ed Davey coming back in terms of that. So you can see, again, the possibility. And you say, well, okay, let's look then at the key wards here. And we've taken 6 wards. And again, the dark red line is the swing from Conservative to Liberal Democrat in the general election. And the dotted line is the swing needed in those wards to take 7 seats to get them a majority, 1.66%. Again, based on every other seat being held, and all other things being equal. So you can see there the vulnerability test.
Have we
I would say
explained swing yet?
No, do you want to?
No. Just to explain what swing is, this is sort of, you know, remember those of you who remember David Butler, the great election expert, still around, age 94 or 5, still around, but invented this concept of swing. Swing meaning, effectively, the votes, you do it between any parties actually. You look at the vote share increase between one election and another for party A, and then the vote share decrease for party B, assuming it's a decrease, and then the difference, the total difference, so if one's up 2 and the other's down 2, it's a difference of 4, divide it by 2, and that's the swing, which in this case would be 2%. So it's a way of gauging the shift of the swing of votes between any one party and any others. So if one went up by 6, the other went up by 2, that would again be a 4 difference, and again a 2% swing, just so explaining what the word means, sorry.
So, and to be entirely politically even-handed, because I have to be, I know Paul Osborne's here and various other Harrow councillors, I thought, well, let's look at the smallest majority that Labour hold, which is Harrow. And look at that. So here we go on the last one, which is Harrow. So here we have the local election share of vote, and you can see how tight it was between Labour and the Conservatives. Almost exactly the same share of vote in the 2014 election, with the Liberal Democrats falling away quite heavily. And the share of vote for the MPs. Now, the interesting thing here, of course, is that Bob Blackman held Harrow East for the Conservatives, quite a totemic victory for him in the general election. But when you look then at the bar chart, this is the wrong way round for you mentally, because he lost share of vote, but he held the seat. So you can see it's going minus that way. But to win, they're setting aside the general election, actually the Conservatives don't need that big a swing from 2014 to possibly get Harrow back. But of course, in the general election, in those key wards, they saw a loss of share of vote. So it's going to be quite an interesting battle. So this one is much harder to call. If you were going to try and call it, the vulnerability test is slightly more trickier to assess. But it is clear that that is potentially, setting aside the general election result, a possibility for Conservatives, if they work that hard, doesn't need that big a swing in those key wards, again, with everything else being equal. So that's my even-handed bit. And then let's just touch on momentum, because I know that there's been a lot of debate in the press about this. And we asked this question, and we just put up 4 bullet points. And I've done these as words, because I think it's important to get the words right. No great surprise there. There is a bigger momentum presence in some boroughs than others. It's very patchy. Quite a few are seeing major challenges, and we've seen in one borough, particularly in Haringey, this last couple of weeks, some very significant challenges with some very senior politicians not being selected. We, LCA, Choney, debating it, could envisage 1 or 2 boroughs' slates in May 2018 being very, very different to 2014. And by dint of that, the possibility of the leadership. But this is where we are on the leadership of some of those boroughs at the moment if they get re-elected next May. Now, we've spent quite a lot of time trying to get our phrasing right on this, because we're conscious there's a lot of debate about it, but that is where we are at the moment. And of course, if a major borough was to see a significant swing to the left in terms of its management next May, there'll be a lot of interest from an awful lot of people to see how that administration then runs.
I think that's like we thought a lot about the words. Let's pause it there and move on.
And finally, before we finish, I mentioned Tower Hamlets earlier, just to say that we don't just think about the core boroughs between the two main parties battling away, all the Liberal Democrats. The wonderful, unique world of Greater London politics does show that some boroughs have a very mixed tapestry. Hounslow, only 2 elections ago, was Conservative and resident controlled. Obviously, Havering and Tower Hamlets both have a very rich mix. And the point here is that there is always the opportunity for surprises. We will have read in the press that Kensington and Chelsea has a party called Advance that's been launched, that has a number of ex-Liberal Democrats involved, but also, I gather, people from different parties looking to put candidates up in possibly every single seat in Kensington and Chelsea.
And just one thing about, intriguingly about Havering is that although, we can see from the earlier evidence there has been, even since the general election, certainly since 2014, other things being equal, a swing from the Conservatives to Labour. But actually, if in Havering the UKIP vote fell by the degree that the national polling suggests it might, then the question of how those votes then fall back for the Conservatives and other parties could have a profound impact, not only here, but particularly here. So it's interesting to see how many bits of there's lots of things moving at once in all of this, and votes moving backwards and forwards between parties in a way that, frankly, isn't as easy to predict as sometimes thought.
Over to you for the summing up.
Right. So, first thing to say is, of course, we're rightly and understandably interested in the London borough elections, London elections taking place this year. Truth is that there are elections taking place elsewhere besides, actually without a list of what they are, which I've forgotten about. So, for example, there are all-out elections in a number of big cities outside London because of rewarding, most but not all of the metropolitan districts and a number of unitaries. So it'll be seen as a big test, not only in London. And of course, although I said at the beginning, these shouldn't be used as grand opinion polls, there is no way that you can stop national journalists and commentators looking at them and then saying, this is going to be seen as a major test for the Conservatives and Theresa May in London, but nationally. It will be used in that way. And, if one of the big 3 Conservative boroughs in central London changed hands, it would be seen as totemic, even if it was well within the normal swings that, were going on that day anyway. So it's no question that the London elections will be scrutinised heavily by national commentators and politicians. I think Labour, it's fair to say, in London will be disappointed if they don't win any more boroughs. And of course, you'll be aware when we run into the borough elections and local elections more generally, everything's played against expectations. So at some point, there'll be an article in one of the national newspapers saying, Labour to win 400 seats, the Conservatives to lose 300, Liberal Democrats, whatever. And then everything's against that background rather than any real real stuff. So, and of course, the parties tend to do this as well. They say, well, of course, our opponents should be doing far better than this. And if they're not doing that well, we're doing better than you thought we would. So, I think Labour would be disappointed anyway if they don't win at least one more borough. Liberal Democrats, I think, obviously pleased to hold Sutton, which is a relatively safe borough, though there is a bit of evidence we've seen earlier on that Labour, who of course were originally much stronger in southwest London than they have been latterly, are beginning to inch back a fraction in southwest London. So worth watching that. And I think, it's possible they could win 1 or, in theory, 2 more boroughs. Depending on how it all turns out, if Vince Cable can articulate a really successful platform in the cities next May. Well, we've been here before. He thinks it's going to be above. I think it's going to be below. Mercifully, the bulk of this wise audience is on my side, but we'll find out. Been wrong about this before. It'd be interesting to see how many boroughs raise council tax before the election, whether the coming of the election is a constraint on boroughs and indeed other authorities when they're running into the elections. And of course, all of this is against the backdrop of absolutely unpredictable national politics. How can I underestimate the extent to which national politics is unpredictable at the moment? There could be 2 general elections. I'm not predicting this. There could be 2 general elections between now or then, or none. Who knows? But the truth is, We must expect the unexpected. And against that backdrop, best of luck for all of you who'll be canvassing and campaigning in the general election, in the local elections. Sorry, that was a Freudian slip. Oh my goodness. In any elections that come up between now and then, and other than that, I don't know if we've got time. Heather, you're in charge.
We've not got time for questions. At the risk of really making John O'Brien very cross, I'm going to say, have we got any quick questions before we wrap up?
Massive disagreements.
I've got...
Who says we're completely wrong? There's a man there who thinks we got it wrong.
Yeah. Hang on, there's a microphone coming.
Sorry, Councillor Neil Nerva. It's about your last slide, really, and it's not trying to hypothise about what's going to happen between now and May, but it's almost certain people are going to be voting not just simply on local issues, but national issues, and how people campaign, what people put in manifestos locally, whether anyone will even read or take an interest. Do you think it's going to be local or national? The people are going to decide when they go to the ballot box.
I think we've managed to get through the whole presentation without mentioning the word I'm now not going to mention. Now, whether that or, I mean, as I've tried to say, I think if you look at the earlier slides here, the earlier charts, they undoubtedly suggest that there is a local impact on London borough elections, not only in London, but in London borough elections. And there's evidence people don't only vote on national issues. Now, whether we've reached a point where national politics is, you know, again, I'm not going to mention the issue I'm not going to mention, but if it's the case that there is such a defining culture war issue out there now which overrides everything, and every election is going to be used as a referendum by people on both sides on an issue I'm not going to mention, then obviously that could change it. But my instincts are that things like council tax, whether the streets are properly swept, whether housing is being built, will still, and rightly, matter more than not only the issue I'm not going to mention, but lots of other national things. You know, is the government doing well? Is Jeremy Corbyn doing well? Is Vince Cable doing well? All of that's in the mix, but I still think there'll be a local impact, Robert.
Can I ask, before you finish that, would raising council tax be, normally it's seen as a bad thing, with the backlash against austerity?
It might be seen as less bad than in the past. I mean, Ben Page's polling and others we've seen do suggest the public goes through mood swings about higher taxes. At the moment, it's shifting towards being slightly more relaxed about them. You know, at some point in the future, it will go back to wanting tax cuts again. You know, we are complicated.
All right. Okay. And any last? No, I think we need to draw. Do we want some predictions? Okay, come on.
That's as good as it's getting today, Julian.
Robert's head of predictions.
Can I just remind those, because I've had a long-running battle with the dear leader of Ealing, my friend Julian here, that obviously I called 2010 wrong, I called 2014 right. I put 250 quid to charity for getting it wrong the first time, and I didn't have to pay it the second time. I may call the borough, but not quite yet, given where we are. But I don't actually normally call them until the spring, so,
And what
I
about
will be
Westminster?
prepared. I'll put 250 quid to charity that Ealing will be Labour on May the 8th. How about that? Is that all right?